I will keep.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Owen.
There he is.
There you go. Now then, let's get our content up there. Y'all ready for this? Y'all are funny.
I don't get it.
We're out of the loop.
Okay, so let me see if I can zoom in a little bit.
Hey Dan, the Gospel Broadcasting Network is having a live call-in night Thursday night at 7.
Yeah?
It's about drinking alcohol.
Ooh. Okay, that ought to be interesting.
Yeah, they want to talk all about Galatians.
Now, this is a manuscript that I have, a column of a manuscript that I own. And it's leather, and this one's probably only 300 or 400 years old. But it's part of Deuteronomy chapter 12. And you can see over here how the leather has been lined and scored right there, the lines.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that the Hebrew letters are hanging down from the lines instead of sitting on top of the lines. See what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So this is a parchment manuscript like the ones I was telling you about from the Old Testament times, obviously made out of leather. And it's from the 12th chapter of Deuteronomy. This particular one is. And it's just a column of the manuscript that's been cut off and framed. And if you look over on this side, you see some of the holes going up the side of the manuscript where it's been sewed together. See, as part of a scroll. So anyway, I collect some stuff like this, and it hangs on my wall, but I thought I'd show you that a little bit up close and personal. Okay. So we're talking about the text of the Old Testament. Now get this. When somebody like me or somebody that's like Denny usually talks about the text of the Bible, we're not talking about anything except the Greek or Hebrew text. The text is what translations are based on. So we're talking about what the text is supposed to say. The original text. Now, the text of the Old Testament is largely based on Masoretic manuscripts like this one. Now, this is a terrible photograph, and I took it probably 30 years ago in England at the British Museum looking down through some glass. And it wasn't very good. It wasn't very good camera work, but this manuscript obviously is in the form of a book or a codex, not a scroll, and it dates from about 850 AD 850, and it's called the British Museum Codex, and it's open to the part that has the 10 Commandments in it in Exodus 20. British Museum Codex, 850 AD. There's a little bit closer up picture of the Hebrew book, and it is in book form, not scroll form. That's why it's called a codex. Codex means in the form of a book that lays flat instead of in the form of a scroll. There are many of these medieval Masoretic manuscripts that are very pretty, especially on the title page. They're illuminated manuscripts, meaning they have neat artwork on them. And this is the front page of the book of Genesis. Over on the left-hand side says Bereshit in the beginning. This manuscript is a 10th century Masoretic manuscript, and it is typical of the Hebrew manuscripts of that time. Masoretic manuscripts are manuscripts that were written between, let's say, 600 AD and 12 or 1300 AD, and they're in Hebrew. The Masoretic scribes, we need to know who those were. Those were medieval scribes, meaning scribes that worked in the Dark Ages, roughly from 600 to 1200 AD, who copied the text based on an inherited scribal tradition. Now, the tradition of, and the tradition which they use is called the Masorah. It's spelled M-A-S-O-R-A-H. M-A-S-O-R-A-H. Masorah. This is a listing of statistical facts about different books of the Old Testament. How many times this word or phrase occurs in the book of Genesis. How many times that verb occurs in the book of Genesis. How many times the name of God occurs in the book of Genesis. How many times it says, and God said, excuse me. Each book of the Bible had its own Masorah, its own scribal tradition about how many times these words and these phrases and these letters were supposed to occur in a given book. And so it was the tradition passed down by these scribes to ensure the accuracy of copying, because the scribes would have to count the words and letters and phrases in a manuscript to make sure they had the proper number according to the Masorah, to make sure that it was legit. If it wasn't legit, they'd have to scrap it or go back and correct it and make sure that everything was as it was supposed to be. Excuse me. So, the Masoretic scribes are the ones that were operating from the Masorah during the medieval time periods. And most of those manuscripts are pretty late in date, long after the time of Jesus. But it was an amazing tradition that they perpetuated to ensure the accuracy of these manuscripts. So, the word for scribe is the word sopher, S-O-P-H-E-R. And that word means literally counter. Because the scribes were always counting the words and the letters and phrases to make sure they matched up with the Masorah, so that they had an accurate copy of Genesis or Leviticus or whatever the biblical book was. So the scribes not only copied the text, but they memorized and copied the Masorah to go along with the text. the scribal tradition was passed down along with the biblical text to ensure its accuracy. Now, these little Hebrew boys are being trained in the manner of Hebrew scribes. They're being taught to memorize the Masorah, and they're also taught the text of Scripture. So they know the Scriptures and they know the Masorah. And their Masorah, their tradition of statistics, is what they use to check themselves to make sure they copy correctly, because there's all kinds of scribal errors that occur when you're copying stuff, and we're going to talk about some of those and what they are. This little Jewish boy in the medieval years is being whooped because he didn't do his homework, or he didn't learn his Masorah, or he didn't do what he was supposed to do. Very much like in Islamic lands today, if you don't memorize the particular surah of the Quran you're supposed to memorize overnight, they take your shoes off and they cane the bottoms of your feet. They whip the bottoms of your feet until they're raw. And the little boys are screaming and everything because their feet are getting whipped. But the next night, they'll come back with their homework done, and they will have memorized that surah. Excuse me, from the Quran. Apologize. So, this is the kind of discipline, this is the kind of rigor that was used in training these Masoretic scribes, because they were responsible excuse me, for the accurate transmission of the text of the Hebrew Bible. So they took it very seriously. There were different groups of Masoretic scribes that had their reputations for their copying and their accuracy and their knowledge, and that was very strict in their training. Excuse me. Now, if you'll look at this Star of David, and if you really look at it closely, you'll see that all of the design around it and the star itself is made up of actually Hebrew writing. It's made up of Hebrew words. And it's actually the Masorah that goes along with this manuscript. This may be a manuscript of Deuteronomy or something, and it's got this design in the front of it. But in the design, you can look at the design and it'll give you the statistics. That it's supposed to have this many times the name of God, and this many phrases of Hear, O Israel, and this many times it says you shall love the Lord your God, and this many times it has the verb beware lest you forget, and some stuff like that. So it'll have all of that in the design written out. So that's one of the ways that scribes preserved the Masorah along with the text of Scripture in the manuscripts. One of the great Masoretic manuscripts is the Leningrad Codex, that it dates at 1008 A.D. And you see between the columns there, you have little notes between the columns, and those are likely different statistics from the Masorah to tell you, how many times these things are supposed to occur in this part of the manuscript. Excuse me. Another medieval codex that's a big basis for the Hebrew Bible is the Aleppo Codex. This, I think, is a manuscript of the prophets. We'll have another listing of these in a little bit. Like some of the others, it's very ornate on the front page. And then it gets less so as you turn the page and get into the text. It's just plain text as it goes along. But you also see in the margins and at the side, they have the Masoretic notes written there. Excuse me, between the columns. This is a picture of doggies and flowers and stuff on the manuscript, but it's actually the Masorah. Because the doggies' ears and noses and bodies and everything and the flowers are made up of Hebrew words. that give you the statistics for how to copy that manuscript. Brother Carl.
What was the date for the Aleppo Codex?
I'm going to give it to you in just a little bit. I haven't got it memorized, so I don't want to tell you, but it's late medieval. I'll tell you when we get to that page. But they're all very late. But it's fascinating when you look at the art tradition that goes along with these and how they were creative in preserving the statistical tables of accuracy. See, in the regular text, you'll have like this, and you'll have the notes and maybe bits of the Masorah in between the columns of the scrolls, where they can check themselves as they copy. Excuse me. All right, so here's the list, and it'd probably be easier for you just to snap a picture of it. But the basic Masoretic manuscripts that we have that are complete are these. We got the British Museum Oriental from 850. It's just a manuscript of the Pentateuch. Then you've got Codex Cairensis, which was found in Cairo. It dates from AD 916. Then you've got the Leningrad manuscript from 1008. And the Aleppo Codex, there you go, Carl, dated 930 AD. Then you've got the Reuchlin Codex of the Prophets from 1105. And then we can't really date the group of Cairo-Geniza fragments. That's pieces of old Hebrew Bibles, 24,000 pages or so of them. They were discovered in 1890, but they date all different dates in the medieval years. They're all Masoretic manuscripts. And they form a big part of the basis of the Hebrew Bible as well. Excuse me. In 1890, there was this scholar whose name was Solomon Schechter. You know how to spell Solomon. Schechter is Schechter, something like that, Schechter. Anyway, he was traveling around looking for manuscripts, and he went to Cairo, Egypt, and he went to a very, very old synagogue there in Cairo named the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. And, excuse me, up in the balcony, the loft that goes around the perimeter of the synagogue, they had a hole in the wall back there. And inside of that hole in the wall was a holy trash can. And so if Rabbi so-and-so had an old Hebrew Bible, like this one that was falling apart, and it had been there for a couple of 100 years and it was all falling apart, they'd open that hole and they'd chunk it back in there because it was a throwaway. And then they'd go on for a while longer, and if they had another old Bible that was worn out, they'd chunk it in the hole. So when they found this Geniza, which means hiding place, in the Cairo Ben Ezra Synagogue, that's Benezra, the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo, all of these fragments of all these old Hebrew manuscripts were just piled in there, and there were about 24,000 pages of them. And this scholar, Solomon Schechter, got them, and he made it his work to separate them, collate them, try to place them with others that belong in the same manuscripts, try to give them dates, all this kind of stuff. So here he is at Cambridge or Oxford or wherever it was, trying to study all of these millions of fragments of Hebrew manuscripts from the Masoretic scribes that he found there, and try to sort them out and gain some perspective on the Hebrew Bible and its text during that time. So that's a lot of pieces of Hebrew manuscripts right there. And of course, when you separate out the ones that are from Exodus and the ones that are from Leviticus and the ones that are from Numbers and the ones that are from Jeremiah, then you can take those other medieval manuscripts and you can compare them with those, and you can learn about the history of the text and how accurately it was copied, etc. This is just one page from the Cairo-Geniza manuscripts. Gives you an idea of the partial nature of how manuscripts survive. This is the way manuscripts are. You know, if you find a document that's 1,000 years old, it's going to be rough, it's going to be holy, it's going to be partial. But what's cool is where you can see the text, you can compare it to the text that we have, and you can learn interesting things from that. All right, so these are other Hebrew manuscripts from that same time period, like the time period of the Great Masoretic manuscripts and the Cairo-Geniza fragments. These would all be from 600 to 1200 AD, roughly. These are some, I think, from the Psalms, and very beautiful, illuminated, you know, with the different Psalms. Here's another typical Old Hebrew manuscript, water stains and all kinds of stuff on them. All right, so up until 1947, the Masoretic manuscripts were all we had. And we were fascinated by their scribal tradition, and they seemed to be, in the medieval years, doing a very good, accurate job of copying it and all that kind of stuff. But in 1947, all that changed because scholars discovered the community of Qumran at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, and they discovered, thanks to a shepherd boy that was chasing his goats, some caves that were near Qumran. And in those caves, there were old jars, clay jars, and those jars had old Hebrew parchment manuscripts stuffed down in them. And what they learned is that there had been a community of Jews living here up until AD 68. For 200 or 300 years, there had been Jews living there. And when the Roman armies came through on their way to destroy Jerusalem in AD 70, they ran from the Roman armies who were pillaging and sacking everything, and they stuffed their entire library in these jars and put them in these caves there near the community of Qumran. So what we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls were found at Qumran near the Dead Sea in 1947. They were a library including Bible books and secular books, or the community books, put it that way, from a Jewish monastic community. The library had been put in 11 different caves to hide the library from the Romans. And these manuscripts date between 250 years BC and AD 68. Now think about this. The oldest Hebrew manuscript we had up to that time dated 850 years after Christ. Now all of a sudden we've got manuscripts dating back to 250 years before Christ. So we've got to jump backward in time now of 1,100 years or so that we can study with what accuracy the text has been copied. The Qumran community near there is a very interesting place. They've learned a lot about that community from their library, and they had some beliefs that were remarkably similar in some respects to the teachings of John the Baptist and the beliefs of ancient Christians, but they believed that there was a Messiah coming, a teacher of righteousness, and that this teacher of righteousness would reveal to them the spiritual meaning of the Old Testament, which is exactly what Jesus did. There are immersion pools found there at Qumran that they practiced ritual immersion in, like we've talked about before. And their library itself is very interesting about their philosophies and things that they believe. But when the Romans came, they stuffed their entire library in those caves, which was good for us because they sat there for 2,000 years and nobody bothered them. So the kid is chasing goats and he throws a rock in one of these caves and he hears a crash bang like something pottery broke. He goes into the cave and there's these big pottery jars, some of them broken, and inside the jars are all these scrolls that have been stuffed in there. Jars like that one, see? And they're full of these ancient manuscripts that have been preserved in great order for a couple thousand years. See, 1947 is a long ways from 250 BC, right? And so think of how much decay would normally occur in 2,000 years. Yet these were in a perfectly dry place inside these jars. And so they were a lot better preserved than most things would be from that time period. Here's another exhibition piecing together some of these pottery jars that these manuscripts were stored in there. This guy is an Arab or Jewish scholar that's pointing out some things in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls there in Israel. And this is old Paleo Hebrew. You can see where the leather is sewn together there in the scroll. This is up close, one of the caves. The Israeli government has now put a nice flat concrete floor in there so people can walk around and look, and trying to make it safe for people to look. This is actually cave number 11. Looking at the cave and where these things were found. This gives you an example of one cave, cave number 4, and the manuscripts that were found in that one cave. There were 11 caves, but this is just one. 11 manuscripts of Genesis in that one cave. 11 of Exodus, 4 of Leviticus, 2 of Numbers, 18 manuscripts of Deuteronomy, and so on. There's, say, 15 manuscripts of Isaiah. So in that one cave, all of those different manuscripts were found, see? And in another cave, another catalog of manuscripts is found. Now, if you're reading materials about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they will be categorized like this. Let's see here. First of all, there will be a number 4, and that means, or there could be a number 1 or a 2 all the way up to 11. But there'll be a 4. That means cave number 4. Then you'll have a Q like this. That means Qumran. Qumran. And then you'll have an abbreviation like this, which means Jeremiah. See, cave number 4 at Qumran, Jeremiah. And then you'll have an A or a B or a C up like that. 4Q Jeremiah A. That means this manuscript was found in cave 4 at Qumran. It's a manuscript of Jeremiah. And A means it's the first manuscript of Jeremiah that was cataloged in that cave. If it says 1Q Isaiah A, it was found in cave 1 at Qumran. It's from Isaiah, and it's the first manuscript of Isaiah cataloged from Cave 1? If it says 3Q Nahum B, that means it was Cave 3, Qumran. It was a manuscript of Nahum, and it was the second manuscript of Nahum cataloged in Cave 3. You with me or not?
Yep.
All right. So you'll read about manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they'll all look like this, one way or another.
What was the final notation there? The
A or the B or whatever is the like let's say in Cave 4 they had 18 manuscripts of Deuteronomy. So if you say 4Q Deuteronomy C, that means that's the third manuscript of Deuteronomy from Cave 4 at Qumran.
Thank you.
Yep. So, obviously, this took the study of the Old Testament text to a whole nother level, because now they could drive it back. They had people that were saying, yeah, we have these manuscripts from the Masoretes, but we have no idea if these really represent what was written earlier. But now they could compare the text of the Qumran scrolls and the text of the Masoretic scrolls, and scholars were shocked at the accuracy of comparison between the two, and it showed that the Masoretic tradition, the Masorah, had really done its job, that they were really carefully transmitting the text, taking great care to do it in a very professional type way. One of the scrolls that made the biggest history when this all came out was 1Q Isaiah A, which is known simply as the Isaiah scroll. But scholars were shocked that this scroll, 250 years before Christ or whatever, should be virtually identical to the Masoretic text. How in the world could anybody transmit that accurately? And the answer is the Masorah. The Masorah. How many times does this word occur? And how many times does this phrase occur? And how many times does the letter mem occur? And how many times does it count? See? And so the scribes had that kind of tradition. They were good at copying the law. They were not as good at obeying the law. And Jesus was quick to point that kind of thing out. So, I love this picture here, because when Jesus stood up in Nazareth and read the book of Isaiah, very likely he was reading something that looked almost exactly like that. And he unrolled it to the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Now, if you go back to this, for example, and if you look at this, and if you look at texts like the one I've got and others, it's quite obvious that there are no chapters, there are no verses, and you roll it to the place where it is written. They knew what was written where, and they knew that if you went past all this, you'd get to that, see? That was the best kind of reference there was. When you're reading in the book of Hebrews, it never says chapter and verse. It says, the Holy Spirit says, and then it just quotes Psalm 95:7. It doesn't tell you Psalm 95:7 because that didn't exist then, but that text existed. It just didn't have a chapter and verse on it, see? So, when we talk to people about an ancient text like Isaiah, we can say, look, there really is compelling physical evidence to highly suggest that we do have an accurate representation of what the prophet Isaiah actually wrote. And here's why. And we can explain the things that we've been studying here today. So it's not just pie in the sky hopefulness. There's real scientific study behind the idea that we have an accurate Bible in the Old Testament. Now, in addition to the Masoretic manuscripts and the Dead Sea manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, we also have a number of versions of the Old Testament that we can use to compare to the Hebrew text. On the left-hand side, you've got the Syriac version of the Old Testament. S-Y-R-I-A-C, Syriac. On the right-hand side, you've got the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. And we have many, many manuscripts of all of these that we can compare with the Hebrew text to see what was there. This is a Bodmer Papyrus 24 at Psalm 110, 1 and following. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. You know? Well, very interesting. But this Greek text confirms what we have in the Hebrew text. Is this parchment or papyrus? Look at it carefully.
That's papyrus.
Yes, it is. You see the fibers going up and down on the right-hand side or in between. You can see the horizontal fibers and the... Well, it says papyrus there too. I didn't realize that.
I didn't get that.
Slam dunk.
Me too.
Hey, Dan.
Yes. Yes, sir.
What is your take on this papyrus that came out a few years ago? The lady had her picture taken with it, saying that it proved Jesus had a wife.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Nobody else heard of it?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
I forget what it was called. But yeah, lady came out with a papyrus saying, this proved that Jesus had a wife, and she was all proud and things.
Well, it could have been a Coptic papyrus of the Nag Hammadi text, the Gospel of Philip, talking about him and Mary Magdalene or something like that. It could have been, there's all kinds of fakes that come out all the time. And unless it comes out in the scholarly journals and it's been reviewed by all these different scholars, we don't pay it any attention. There's always something weird coming up like that, and first time the real scholars examine it, they say, no, it's not because of this, that, and the other. This is not genuine. Here's another example of a Greek papyrus manuscript of the Old Testament. These are called secondary witnesses to the Old Testament text when you're talking about versional evidence, including Syriac and Greek and Armenian and Latin. So you've got the Septuagint text, the Greek text. You've got Aramaic targums, which are paraphrases. They're not really good for accurate comparison, but they'll give you the gist. See, what happened is, excuse me, by the time of Jesus, very few people actually spoke biblical Hebrew or read biblical Hebrew except the scribes. The people like Jesus and his mother and everything, just on the street every day, they read and understood Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of Syria. They spoke that. It was like Hebrew, but different, see? And so when they would read the Hebrew Bible in the synagogues, there was usually an Aramaic targum or translation or paraphrase that would explain to the people what the Hebrew Bible said. See? So these Aramaic targums are like paraphrases in Aramaic. There's the Latin Vulgate of Jerome. It's a Latin translation he did in the 4th century AD of the Old Testament. There were old Latin manuscripts before that time. We've already talked about Syriac. There was also Coptic and Armenian and Gothic, and there's several other ancient versions of the Old Testament. Those are secondary. So, I use the Septuagint quite a bit because if you're checking on something and you read the Septuagint, especially if it's in the law, well, that Septuagint translation goes back to 250 years before Christ, so that's a pretty good check on what's there in the Hebrew text in a lot of cases. Anybody want to ask anything that's on your mind about any of this stuff? Yes, sir.
If the Septuagint goes back to 250 BC, that's in the intertestamental period, right?
Yes.
So,
And the Dead Sea Scrolls go back that far. But remember, the Septuagint only goes back that far in its translation of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The rest of it was translated later, so. Anybody else? Yep, Aaron?
When you mentioned that most of the people did not actually speak Hebrew as much as they spoke Aramaic, when it's talking in Acts chapter 22, where Paul is kind of being taken away by the soldiers, and then he asks to address the crowd, and he speaks to them in the Hebrew language, and it says that they kept silent because he spoke in the Hebrew language. Is that talking about Hebrew, or is that Aramaic?
Aramaic.
Okay.
Yeah. And it means Aramaic. Even when, it says it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, it was actually written in Aramaic and Greek and Latin, but it means the language of the Hebrews, which was at that time Aramaic.
Dan?
Yes, sir.
A lot of the pieces that we can see of the different papyri and even the parchments are really, really horribly broken up as far as their completion.
Yep.
How many really good copies do we have that might look like these that are on the screen right now?
Well, most of the copies you're going to have are like this. Now, some of the later manuscripts, you have page after page of perfect copies, But when you have a page that's like this, let's say this one is 500 years older than the one that you have a perfect copy of. But you can put that next to the same page or the same section in that later copy, and then you can really check accuracy there and see how the text was transmitted. Imagine, the way I like to explain this is like this. Let's say that you take all of the Hebrew manuscripts that we have and you lay them out on a gymnasium floor, page by page. You lay them out. And you start with the latest ones, and you successively go back earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier, okay? You group them into all the Deuteronomies and all the Genesises and all the Exoduses, and you go from latest to earliest, okay? Then you photograph, and you collate, which means you record the readings that are in those manuscripts, and you trace them from the beginning all the way up, and you can see in the progression wait a minute, there's a change right here. Something changed right here. And you can see what it was. There's two manuscripts, and one wrote it this way and one wrote it that way. There was an error made there, you know. And so that's oversimplified, but that's kind of the way they do it. And in going backward, they can say, okay, this reading right here doesn't exist before the 5th century. If you keep going backward, that reading doesn't exist. Well, what does that tell you?
Somebody made a mistake. Something was changed.
That's right. See, and so with the Greek New Testament, we've got 5,000 some odd different manuscripts, and if you put all of those out on the gym floor from the end of the 1st century AD all the way up to the 1600s, and you group them together into the Matthews, Marks, Lukes, Johns, and Acts, and Romans, then you can follow the family trees of those manuscripts back from the latest to the earliest, and you can say, wait a minute, here's where something happened, and here's where something happened, and so you can tell when errors arose and how they arose, and you can get back to what the original text was. Now see, today, all of these manuscripts are photographed. All of these manuscripts are collated. All of these manuscripts are computer crunched. See? So it's a very, very scientific study which can trace and verify the accuracy of the text. Brother Ben.
I've noticed in some of the Bibles I've used in class, they'll have a particular sentence that will have a designation, and say early manuscripts do not contain this. Why do they even put that in there then? Why not completely?
Because the politics are so strong, and so many people get mad if you just say, this reading is not part of the original Gospel of John. People get mad because it's in the King James Version. And they don't realize that the King James was based on manuscripts that dated from the 10th to the 16th century AD. 6 of them, 6 manuscripts. As opposed to 5,800 and something manuscripts we now have that go all the way back to the 1st century AD. See? But if you tell somebody that Grandma's Bible has a line in it that wasn't original, then Grandma's going to get mad, and so is Grandpa, and they're not going to give the preacher his paycheck if he says that. All right. Who else would like to ask a question? We're going to get into all that in a detailed way in this section of the class, but who else wants to ask something while we're asking? Yep.
When you were talking about the Isaiah scroll found in Cave 1, do you know the date that scroll is placed at?
I don't.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up, but it's around 200, 258 BC, something like that.
Okay, so it's on the BC side.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're going to talk about later is the science of paleography. Paleography is the study of the way scribes made their letters in various time periods. And there is a definite evolution in the way that letters were made in earlier and later time periods. For example, we'll go to this other thing over here. In the time of Christ, a delta was made something like this. But as time went by, a delta started growing something on the top. And as more time went by, he started getting longer. And as more time went by, it was more like this. I got that one messed up. That's what I meant to do. But the tails grew longer, so the letters changed. The lambda was like this in the first century. But gradually, it was like that monkey growing a longer tail. Gradually, over the centuries, it started looking like that. See? And the upsilon in the first century was like this. That's a upsilon. But he was like Darwin, like the human beings and the monkeys, because the longer time went by, the tail started getting shorter on that rascal. And before you know it, he had turned into a human being without a tail.
Evolved.
He evolved. But you can take manuscripts from different centuries and you can demonstrate these things. And a good Greek scholar can really date a manuscript very accurately by the way the letters are made. He can say this one's got to be between the 4th and 6th century right here, and this and this and this tells me it's in the 5th century. That's called the science of paleography. Somebody else want to ask a question? I'm taking that as a no. What time is it?
11:35.
Okay, we've only got 10 minutes. Let's ask questions.
How much does something like that cost that you have on your wall there?
Um,
I mean, those are cool things to have, but
it's
It might be-
probably. I don't know. I don't know how much I paid for that. It probably typically $200 or $300 or something like that for one little piece of something like that. I just like to have examples of the stuff I'm teaching about. I've got a lot of books with a lot of pictures of stuff that I'll use in this class to show you. Nobody has thought of something else you'd like to ask? There's no way. And see, the thing about it is, who cares? But when you're really trying to tell somebody who doesn't trust the Bible, if you can show them some of this stuff, they'll say, well, I had no idea all this was evidence behind the Bible. I didn't realize that all this stood behind the text of the Bible. I had no idea that there's really physical evidence that shows that it's this way. And it really does confirm people's faith, because there's no other book in antiquity that has anything like this. Yep, Aaron?
As far as the recent discovery at Qumran goes, I'm assuming that there's some kind of critical Hebrew text similar to the critical Greek text that we have. Is that something that exists? Oh, you have one there? Okay.
And see, in the I'll show you on this other thing, except for just the text itself. See, just like in the Greek text, down below the text, this is the apparatus down here that gives you different manuscripts and what these manuscripts read, if there's a variant reading somewhere. This stuff down here. So this is a critical Hebrew text based on all those manuscripts. See, MSS, that's 3 manuscripts read this way at this point, and 13 manuscripts read this way, and 45 manuscripts from this source read that way, and yeah. Does that answer your question, Aaron?
Yeah, it does. And I suppose that translations such as the New American Standard would have as their textual basis the critical text you have there.
What is that called?
Biblica Hebraica.
Thank you.
And that's similar to UBS for the Greek?
Yes.
That's the idea, is a committee or something that dictates how that's constructed? Gotcha.
Yes. And this is constructed based upon all the manuscripts, all the versions, all the stuff. This is the critical text at this stage right here. Somebody else? All right. The thing about this section of the class is there's a lot of new material that's presented. It's not like we've gone over it 1,000 times before, you know. And so it's a lot to soak in, but we'll just have a test over this one section. Not now, not soon, but we won't put 2 sections in a test on this one. It'll just be over one section. Do you know what a version is?
Translation.
Translation.
What's a Masoret? Is that some kind of an insect? What is a Masoret? A Masoretic?
Some bent over dude that's
Yeah. He's a scribe. What does the word scribe really mean?
Count.
Counter. Yeah.
A counter. What were they always counting?
verbs,
Phrases.
Occurrences of words and phrases.
That's right. And that tradition, which was the tradition of all the words and phrases that were supposed to be there, is called the Masorah. Masorah. So the scribes that followed the Masorah are the Masoretic scribes. Hello?
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay. I thought you froze right there for a minute, but you didn't.
we did. We were overwhelmed.
I'm sure. All right, so the copying of the Hebrew text was very professionally done because the Jews as a nation took it very seriously and they trained people rigorously to do the copying because they were very ticky about the accuracy of the text of the Bible. That shows you the esteem in which they held the Bible. However, as we're going to start talking about next time, the New Testament text is a different ballgame. Because from the very beginning of the New Testament church, it was illegal and it was an underground movement. And the professional community was not allowed to transmit the New Testament documents. And so we have a completely different ballgame, at least in the beginning, in the text of the New Testament, as we had in the text of the Old Testament. We do see, that there was a collection of the letters, which means that, like when Peter talks about all Paul's letters, obviously people were making copies of Paul's letters, even in the first century, and in the case of the other documents as well. But those copies are very interesting because there's no standard paper size, there's no standard letter size, there's they're written on different things. It's like whatever people had, they wrote on. It could be a little tiny piece of papyrus this big. It could be great big sheets of papyrus. It could be everything in between. And it's very interesting because it was the Wild West back there in Christian circles in the first 300 years of Christianity. So they taught, they read, they practiced what was written in the New Testament documents, but it was a crime to do what they did in the Roman law. So they had to hide it, and they had to do it underground. But we have two different sets, two different texts, which are virtually identical. We have the Nestle-Aland text over on the right-hand side. It's a critical Greek text. And then we have the UBS, United Bible Society's Greek text, over on the... Nestle-Aland is over on the right side. UBS is on the left side. And both of them are critical texts, and they're basically identical to each other. Don't get these confused with the Textus Receptus that is something completely different. Now, I gave you the chart of the Old Testament and what it's based on. Don't look at this. Don't look at this. We'll look at it next time.
Alrighty.
Thanks, Dave.
Yep.
That thing I said was first century BC.